Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, and McClernand just finished fighting the Battle of Belmont, and now he moves on to more grandiose campaigns in the Western theater. Although the Battle of Belmont had ended, McClernand dealt with a personal and military situation that emerged from the engagement. It resulted in McClernand's aide-de-camp, Captain Alexander Belaski, a Polish immigrant, being killed. The general grieved over the loss of such a vital part of his command and a good person. He wrote a condolence letter to the man's widow, informing her that he died as a hero, covered in glory. Miss Belaski wanted the body brought back to Springfield and tasked Reverend L.P. Clover to recover the body. Because of the military situation, McClernand refused to allow Clover to travel to the battlefield, which turned into a scandalous story about the general not honoring the wishes of a widow of this war. Newspapers who supported McClernand accused Clover of being a secessionist. McClernand wrote to Confederate General Leonidas Polk, the Southern adversary at Belmont, to look for the body. Belaski was recovered from the field and given a funeral in Springfield on November 12th. McClernand attempted to use his political power to gain the infields he contracted earlier by insisting to Governor Yates that if the men possessed adequate weapons, the engagement would have been more decisive. Not wanting the blood of dead Illinoisans on his hands, Yates agreed to purchase McClernand's infields, but when the agent went to pick them up, the U.S. government declared authority in distribution over all weapons. McClernand's infantry would have to make do with what they had until January, when Grant secured the weapons they needed. McClernand acted as a political choice for Lincoln, who hoped that his appointment to brigadier general would sway Southern Illinois firmly into the camp of the Union, despite their Southern ties. McClernand deviated from the chain of command when corresponding with the president directly and his other superiors, who kept reminding him that he needed to follow military etiquette. Nevertheless, McClernand attempted to assert his political power that he possessed, particularly in a change in the war objectives. The first Confiscation Act labeling runaway slaves as contraband only intensified the feeling of many Northerners that the war was becoming about fighting slavery. McClernand wrote that discontented Republicans pushing for an end to slavery threatened the integrity of Illinois by attempting to change the objective of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. McClernand even supported congressmen in the ranks to resign from the Army to keep their seats in Congress to potentially fight against this change in objective. During the winter of 1861, the department in which McClernand was in got reorganized. Henry Halleck replaced John C. Fremont as McClernand and Grant's commander. Washington wanted action against the Confederates, and in the West, Grant and McClernand gave them action. On January 10, 1862, McClernand and his command made it to Fort Jefferson, Kentucky in an attempt to prevent troops from the western side of the Bluegrass State from reinforcing positions in the middle and eastern portions. Once at Fort Jefferson, McClernand demonstrated great skill and understanding of military operations when he ordered field fortifications thrown up to guard their camp and then coordinated with the naval element to shell the Confederates in Columbus, Kentucky, to conceal the infantry and cavalry's intentions. By January 18th, the expedition ended, and by the 21st, McClernand was back in southern Illinois with his brigade. Grant brewed with ideas for an attack on the Confederate defenses along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. McClernand was given division command and told at the beginning of February to prepare his men for a movement on Fort Henry. His division landed 8 miles downstream from Fort Henry on February 4th at 4:30 a.m. Grant changed his mind as to where his men needed to disembark and ordered McClernand closer to Fort Henry, just 4 miles to the north of the Confederate works. McClernand personally reconnoitered the ground between his camp and the fort. Grant arrived and on board the Cincinnati called together his division commanders, McClernand and Charles F. Smith, as well as Flag Officer Andrew Foote and Captain of the Conestoga, Seth Phelps. Phelps brought aboard a Confederate torpedo he lifted from the river. Officers gathered around to observe while the boat's armorer unscrewed the cap. As the cap loosened, a loud sizzling noise erupted. McClernand and Smith threw themselves on the boat's deck, while Foote and Grant ran for the boat's ladder. The sailors who witnessed this event roared with laughter, for the noise had been only the gases generated by the wet powder in the torpedo. Once the senior commanders of the expedition had composed themselves, they all had a hearty laugh over the incident. Grant planned for the assault to begin on February 6th at 11 a.m. McClernand would move down the east bank of the river and place his brigades between Fort Henry and Fort Donelson just a few miles away to prevent the former from being reinforced by the latter. Smith's brigades would attack on the west bank to capture Fort Hyman, while Foote shelled the works. In Grant's directive, he ordered McClernand to move with the guidance of Lieutenant Colonel McPherson. McClernand became worried that Grant meant that McPherson would be usurping his command and asked Grant to clarify the order. McClernand had grown suspicious of West Pointers, probably because they represented a challenge to his military and political authority, them being considered more skillful than he was in military operations. Grant cleared up the matter by telling McClernand that McPherson was simply to guide McClernand to the correct spot along the road, not to command his troops. The heavy rains made McClernand's march slow. He was supposed to prevent the rebels from escaping, but did not reach the destination until 2:30 p.m. In the meantime, 2,500 Confederates evacuated Fort Henry before it capitulated. McClernand's men would be the first troops inside the fort. McClernand renamed it Fort Foote in honor of Flag Officer Foote, something he had no authority to do. Grant ignored the name change, although McClernand kept using it in his correspondence. Grant met with his commanders and they decided to press on without delay to Fort Donelson. McClernand's men took the lead on February 11th and reached them on the 12th. John's division left open a gap on the right between his rightmost brigade and the river, so he ordered that flank to dig in. A significant creek separated his left from Charles Smith's division. Both divisions were in a precarious situation, but each division commander ordered attacks without approval from Grant. Both failed. That night, 3 inches of snow fell, covering the shivering Union soldiers who abandoned their overcoats and blankets on the march from Fort Henry to Donelson. Grant quickly organized troops to fill the gap between McClernand and Smith, hoping to mostly cut off the Confederate garrison while his gunboats pounded the Confederates into submission. At 5 a.m. on February 15th, the rebels came out of their works on the Union right and delivered a devastating attack to McClernand's division. John sent word to Lew Wallace in the center to send what help he could to stabilize the Union line that was near its breaking point as the Confederates made repeated assaults against McClernand's line. For over 6 hours, McClernand fought a stubborn withdrawal with the help of Lew Wallace before Grant found his army on the verge of annihilation. By mid-afternoon, McClernand's command had been bloodied and now mostly ineffective. It would be Lew Wallace, who with help from McClernand would lead a counterattack constructed by Grant to send the rebels back into their works. But before the counterattack could begin, the rebels, through miscommunication, pulled back to where they had began their assault early that morning. The next day, part of the garrison escaped, leaving Simon Bolivar Buckner to ask for surrender terms from Grant. The Union commander would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Again, with breaking military protocol, McClernand wrote personally to Lincoln informing him of the actions taken by him and his command in the battle. His highly colorful words made his division stand out above the others, and he slighted some of his fellow division commanders. Nevertheless, McClernand was becoming an effective and capable military commander. He held his division together despite vicious assaults by the enemy and allocated support troops appropriately to the areas of greatest need. His abilities were only improving, but he still fashioned himself a politician even while a general.